Nearly 1 century after the Lincoln administration issued the Emancipation Proclamation, the African American citizens of the United States faced extreme persecution, discrimination, and segregation. The ideologies of pre-Civil War white Americans had stuck around, primarily in the households of Southern families. This cost African American people their jobs, houses, education, and food, among countless other necessary provisions. This unimaginable discrimination was present as a societal norm, arguably until the mid-1950s with the famous Brown v. Board of Education case. This case struck down the constitutionality of separate but equal terms for segregation, and ignited the following decade with countless pushes for the civil rights of all people in the country. The 1960s were filled with sit-in protests, boycotts, and freedom marches. These are some of the most important events in United States history, and they harbored consequences including the election of John F. Kennedy and his assassination, the appointing of Thurgood Marshall to the federal Supreme Court, the Detroit race riots, and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s influence on the American people.
John F. Kennedy, elected as a result of the 1960 presidential elections, became the youngest man to be elected into office at age 43. He is beaten by only Theodore Roosevelt, who assumed the presidency at 42 years of age after McKinley was assassinated in 1901. Despite his youth and Catholic faith, Kennedy secured the necessary votes for the Democratic nomination at the last second, winning Wyoming's delegates. Now that he was officially running a successful campaign for president, Kennedy needed to gain national popularity. He challenged his running mate, Richard Nixon, to 4 different televised debates, the first of their kind, so that the public could determine for themselves, in real time, who the greater candidate for president truly was. Though Nixon's advisors saw through to Kennedy's intentions, Nixon had confidence in his own campaign. He confidently agreed to share a platform with his rival on nationwide television. John F. Kennedy took full advantage of television and psychology, meeting with producers and even coordinating his outfit so that he stood out more. The advantages that Vice President Nixon did not take, as well as his involvement in extreme anti-communist measures, subsequently caused the public to favor the Democratic Kennedy rather than his Republican running mate. In the end, Kennedy won the support of Martin Luther King Sr. and the election itself. He was sworn into office on January 20, 1961. John F. Kennedy became the youngest elected president, the first Catholic president, and the first to be born in the 20th century. During his time in office, he dealt with Soviet influence on Cuba and the high chances of a nuclear war, signed bills such as the Equal Pay Act of 1963, and pushed for advances in the space race. The contributions Kennedy made in just shy of 3 years in office forever affected the United States, the welfare of its people, and its economy. His life, cut short by an assassin in late 1963, was dedicated to making America a country in which its citizens asked, not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. President Kennedy made it clear that all Americans, regardless of their skin color, should enjoy a good and happy life in the United States. On November 22, 1963, the president was shot by a man, Lee Harvey Oswald, as he rode in an open vehicle in a Dallas, Texas parade. He died as a result of his injuries, and his assassin was murdered only 2 days later by a very angry Kennedy supporter, called Jack Ruby. Because of this, not much can be known about the assassination, including whether Oswald acted alone or was even at fault for the murder. On the political side of things, the government established the Warren Commission in order to investigate the circumstances of the late president's death. Despite the fact that some witnesses believe there had to have been a second shooter, as there were shots fired from another direction as well, the Warren Commission determined that not only was Oswald the killer, but he acted alone. To this day, dozens of conspiracy theories surround Kennedy's death. In addition to the creation of the Warren Commission, the death of Mr. Kennedy brought on the inauguration of Vice President Lyndon Johnson as President of the United States. Though he encouraged his citizens to press on with dignity and good spirits after their beloved president's passing, he was met in office by a deeply discouraged nation. According to an account from the Washington Examiner, Americans in the years after 1963 were more inclined to become disillusioned with their leaders, and the next 2 presidents were, in effect, forced out of office, Johnson by Vietnam and Richard Nixon by Watergate. In October of 1967, a man by the name of Thurgood Marshall was placed in a seat on the Supreme Court. Marshall was an African-American man living in the height of segregation. He even attended a segregated high school. He spoke against the Plessy v. Ferguson ruling of separate but equal in the famous Brown v. Board of Education case, which would ultimately contribute to his nomination. His arguments helped push the Supreme Court to overrule the Plessy v. Ferguson decision, therefore declaring segregation unconstitutional. When Lyndon B. Johnson nominated him for the Supreme Court, and when he was sworn in, the difference in opinion of the American people could truly be seen. A number of people celebrated this accomplishment of the civil rights movement, while others deeply resented Mr. Marshall's appointment. Never before had this been done. Thurgood Marshall was officially the first African American to sit on the Supreme Court bench. He would sit there for 24 years, eventually taking part in the historic Roe v. Wade decision on abortion. While Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. pushed for civil rights by way of protests and speeches, Marshall was able to firsthand make a difference in the way people of a variety of races and backgrounds are treated in the United States. Civilian response to racial injustice was quite a bit less civilized. In late July 1967, African American residents of the poorest Detroit suburb gathered at an illegal bar, one in which alcohol was not permitted to be sold, to celebrate the return of 2 soldiers from Vietnam. Detroit police raided the bar upon catching word of the activity and arrested all 82 partygoers. About 5:00 a.m. the next morning, a crowd of hundreds had gathered around, following rumors that brutality had been exercised when removing the individuals from the bar. Suddenly, a bottle was thrown, then a trash can. In a 20-minute span, a full-on riot had begun. Citizens began to angrily throw glass, bricks, stones, and any other harmful items they could find. Their main target? Police officers, under the belief that they were being personally targeted and unlawfully arrested. Within hours, fires began consuming homes across Detroit, and the National Guard was brought in to control the havoc. The violence lasted 5 days, in which 33 blacks and 10 whites were killed. 1,189 were injured, and over 7,200 people were arrested. Approximately 2,500 stores were looted, and the total property damage was estimated at about $32 million. The riots caused a strained relationship between President Lyndon B. Johnson and the Michigan Governor George Romney. Johnson blamed Romney, asserting that he could not maintain control over his Detroit. Detroit was left in ruins, and the desolation that resulted from the simple throwing of a bottle proved to be an example to the people of the United States. There was anger, tension, and bitterness due to the lack of equal rights for the African American people. This near week of destruction had never been matched before, and would remain the most violent and costly riot the nation had seen until the death of Martin Luther King Jr. in 1968. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. began his activist career in 1955, when he gained national attention for leading a bus boycott in Montgomery, Alabama. He used his newfound infamy to spread a message of racial equality across the United States until his death in 1968. He organized sit-ins, nonviolent protests, and spoke all throughout the country about his own American dream, equality among the people. King was the son of a Baptist pastor by the same name, born in Atlanta, Georgia on January 15, 1929. On August 28, 1963, the peaceful protester led thousands of others in a march on Washington for jobs and freedom. The objective of the march was to turn the attention of the government toward the low employment rates of African Americans, due to the discrimination and segregation that they faced. It was during this time that he gave his famous "I Have a Dream" speech, in which he declared, 100 years after the Emancipation Proclamation, the life of the Negro is still sadly crippled by the manacles of segregation and the chains of discrimination. 100 years later, the Negro lives on a lonely island of poverty in the midst of a vast ocean of material prosperity. 100 years later, the Negro is still languished in the corners of American society and finds himself in exile in his own land. King, along with thousands of other protesters that hot summer day, helped influence the government's passage of bills such as the Equal Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act, and the Fair Housing Act. King's life, like Kennedy's, was cut short by an assassin. He had been speaking at a sanitation workers' strike in Memphis, Tennessee, the day prior to his murder on a second-story balcony of a hotel. His alleged killer, striking him with a sniper's bullet, was called James Earl Ray. Despite numerous attempts, even by King's own widow, to reopen Mr. Ray's case, it was determined that Ray did, in fact, fire the fatal bullet. King's death was seen as white resistance to any chance of racial equality in the United States, and according to History Education, radicalized many moderate African-American activists, fueling the growth of the Black Power movement and the Black Panther Party in the late 1960s and early 1970s. The 1960s was a decade of major tragedy. In the span of a decade, America lost a president and a prominent civil rights leader to an assassination. Death and destruction consumed Detroit for a long summer week. These years, however, were those in which major civil reform was put in place. Countless bills were passed into law that gave African American people equal rights to their white counterparts. Tolerance levels rose as Thurgood Marshall took a seat on the Supreme Court bench. These occurrences ultimately shaped America as it is today. Civil rights continues to be an integral part of politics. The historical figures of the 1960s are widely regarded as some of the most important, influential people that this country has had the privilege of being led by.